Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Aaron Rosen. I serve as the founding president of the World Affairs Council of Miami. We are so pleased to collaborate with the World Affairs Councils of Atlanta, San Antonio, and Connecticut to put together today's timely rapid response partnership program on the capture of Nicolás Maduro, what comes next for Venezuela, and the U.S. Venezuelan relationship. Our goal with today's program is to accomplish at least some and hopefully all of the following: to explain the Trump administration's actions with regard to Venezuela, to assess its objectives, to evaluate its motivations, including those stated and perhaps those understated, to weigh the likelihood of possible outcomes, and to place the current events of the past few days within broader regional, global, and strategic context. Thankfully, we are joined today by two exceptional former U.S. ambassadors whose unparalleled knowledge of U.S. foreign policy in the region will help us unpack these and other important elements. We'll also be sure to take questions from the audience in today's program, so be sure you submit them via the Q&A function below. Before we get to that, however, I'd like to pass the mic over to my colleague, Ricky Bevington, who serves as the president of the World Affairs Council of Atlanta, without whom today's event would not be possible. Thank you so much, Ricky, for your friendship and your partnership. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Aaron. It's always a pleasure to work with the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. My name is Ricky Bevington. I'm president of the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. Founded in 2010 as a nonpartisan nonprofit organization, the World Affairs Council of Atlanta prepares our region's leaders for success in an increasingly interconnected world. And that's what we're here to do today. We want to give you all, our audience members, nearly 400 of you today, thank you for joining us, the opportunity to ask questions, which is a unique service of World Affairs Councils, Miami and Atlanta and others. And that's what we're going to get to. So here's some logistics and some housekeeping. This program is recorded and it's on the record. The statements made today are those of the speaker and not of the World Affairs Council of Atlanta or the World Affairs Council of Miami. Our panelists will provide opening remarks, followed by brief moderated discussion with Aaron and I, and then we will invite audience questions. And so if you have a question, and we know you do, please use the Q&A box. It's at the bottom of your screen, and we will give you another reminder once again to ask a question. Please keep it brief because we're going to have to read them. Use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And now it is my pleasure to introduce both of our esteemed panelists today. Ambassador Charles Shapiro is the past president of the World Affairs Council of Atlanta and senior lecturer at the Robinson College of Business at Georgia State University. From 2011 to 2013, Shapiro was the president of the Institute of the Americas, a think tank at the University of California, San Diego. Previously, he held numerous senior positions at the U.S. Department of State, including ambassador to Venezuela, principal deputy assistant secretary for the Western Hemisphere, and coordinator for Cuban affairs. Welcome, Ambassador Shapiro.
Thank you.
And Ambassador Luis Moreno served as U.S. ambassador to Jamaica and previously, among many senior positions in the U.S. Department of State, as Narcotics Affairs Director at the U.S. Embassy in Bogota, Colombia, where he was instrumental in planning and implementing Plan Colombia. That's a U.S. foreign aid and military initiative aimed at supporting counter-narcotics in Colombia. Welcome, Ambassador Moreno. We are going to begin with opening statements from Ambassador Shapiro, and then we will continue, and I will invite Ambassador Moreno to unmute yourself after Ambassador Shapiro gives his opening remarks. Take it away, Charles.
Thanks, Ricky. It's a pleasure to be here. And my current employer, the Sam Nunn School at Georgia Tech, insists that I have to also say that I'm also a professor at the Sam Nunn School. And there you go. Go Yellow Jackets. I'm going to say this as quickly as I can, because I'm assuming that, if you cared enough to register for this, that you've been following events in Venezuela and you don't need us to tell you, sort of what happened first, second, and third. But my analysis is that the Trump administration is putting stability over democracy by working with Delcy Rodriguez as president of Venezuela and after the removal of Nicolás Maduro. I think that's going to be difficult over the long run to maintain that. The news today from Venezuela is that people within the Maduro administration are not just feuding with words, but actually coming to blows in Caracas. So that's going to be really interesting to watch. The what essentially we have is the Maduro dictatorship without Maduro, including the Minister of Interior, the guy that controls the police, was indicted alongside Maduro and Celia Flores, his wife, and he's continuing as the Minister of Interior. He's the enforcer, the tough guy within the Maduro administration, and he's continuing in that role. Number two, the Venezuelan oil industry. Was this about democracy or was this about oil? The administration is counting on using funding from the Venezuelan oil industry to cover the costs of, first of all, rebuilding the oil industry, which has been allowed to deteriorate over the past 25 years. They're going to use it to, I mean, the president said this Saturday in his press conference, they're going to use it to reimburse American oil companies for money that they've lost since their concessions in Venezuela were nationalized in 2007 under the Hugo Chavez government. They're going to use it to reimburse Venezuelan Americans. Let me change that. Venezuelans in the United States, most of them are not American citizens, for what they lost when their holdings were nationalized. And in addition, that money's got to be used to run the government of Venezuela. That's the primary source of funding for the government of Venezuela. And presumably the oil companies, or the U.S. oil companies involved, are all going to want return on their investment. So that's going to be a lot of competing demands on money coming from the oil industry. Right now, they're pumping about 1 million barrels a day. Number three, democracy. I've talked about it already, but Edmundo Gonzalez was elected president of Venezuela in July of 2004 in elections that Gonzalez won the election, but Maduro stole the vote count. I can explain that to you if you're interested and go into detail. Maria Corina Machado, the woman who just won the Nobel Peace Prize in early December, was the power behind that. She campaigned across the country. She's the one who's got political smarts and is charismatic and is a fabulous campaigner. The guy who actually ran, Edmundo Gonzalez, he's a retired diplomat and is about as charismatic as Ambassador Moreno and myself. But what's happened since then is, 14 reporters, Venezuelan reporters, were arrested on Monday by the Venezuelan police. Things have continued. And you notice that President Trump and Secretary of State Rubio, they've not talked about democracy at all. They've talked about oil. Next point is unilateralism, and that is the United States doing this on its own, no consultation with our allies in Europe or in Latin America. And it means a couple of things. Number one is that no other country is likely to assist us over the next year and a half as we try to normalize things in Venezuela. And number two, it means that every president or prime minister in Latin America and Caribbean of a country which either produces drugs or through which drugs are trafficked have got to be super concerned by what happened in Venezuela. I did an interview with a Colombian radio station a couple of days ago, and that's their first question. What does this mean for the president of Colombia? This is going to be very complicated. And my final point is power politics. What the Trump administration is talking about, and you saw it sort of epitomized yesterday by Stephen Miller, the deputy chief of staff of the White House, is that, the United States is one of the big countries can call the shots and do what we want to without regard to our allies, without regard to the countries that are the object of those actions, and without regard to international law. That sounds good in one way, that the United States can do what we want and everybody else has got to lump it, but it also means that Russia and China could do the same. That we're reverting to an era of power politics, of spheres of influence, which, if that part of history that all of us thought was so boring and we slept through, 19th century politics, the age of imperialism, where there were no rules and the big countries did what they wanted as they divided up Africa, that's what we're returning to. And that's going to be very risky for the United States and complicated over the long term. There you go. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Shapiro. Ambassador Moreno, you have a reputation in diplomatic circles as an expert on counter-narcotics. And as Ricky mentioned, were yourself instrumental in planning and implementing Plan Colombia. Can you please help us understand the U.S. government's claim that this was ultimately an anti-narcotics law enforcement operation, as well as the degree to which Venezuela actually is the narco state that the administration is claiming it is?
Well, right from the get-go, when this campaign started and we ramped up operations in the Caribbean, attacking the fast boats, there were legal issues. The head of Southcom decided to take an early retirement. The Judge Advocate General guys gave their opinion and were dismissed. And we were attacking and have killed over 100 people on these fast boats. Uh, these fast boats have no way of reaching the United States. They were not carrying fentanyl, and sometimes they weren't even carrying uh, cocaine. Some of the boats and bodies have washed up on the Guajira Peninsula. Uh, the Indian tribe, the Wayus, the bodies were burnt, and marijuana was found on the beaches. Not the coke, and they're not headed to the U.S. They're going eastward to the island chains and for eventual transport to Africa and up to Europe. So it's not even headed to the US. If you look at what to follow up on, it's always intimidating to follow my former boss, Ambassador Shapiro, but I'll try to do my best here and address something he mentioned about the indictments. And it's Venezuela's like a hydra. You chop off one head, Maduro, but you have people who are actually on the indictment. Minister of Interior, Diosdado Cabello, and Padrino Lopez, the Minister of Defense, who are still in. And the most ironic thing about this, I find, if you look at that indictment against Nicolás Maduro, and no one should be said about Nicolás Maduro leaving the scene by any means, you take that indictment and you put it right next to the indictment against Juan Orlando Hernandez, the former president of Honduras, who was convicted in the same courtroom that Maduro is going to be tried in. Uh, they're the exact same indictments, and this guy was converted Honduras into an actual uh, narco state, and he was pardoned by President Trump. Ironically, the investigation and prosecution was led by Emil Bove, who, if you recall, during the Stormy Daniels hush money trial in New York, was sitting next to Trump, his personal lawyer, and Trump appointed him to the federal bench. So I guess that guy, was didn't do a good job according to the administration that they allowed. The other thing we have to keep into mind is the 1,500-mile border between Colombia and Venezuela. Triple canopy jungle infested with tens of thousands of people, former ELN guerrillas or actual active duty ELN guys, renegade FARC guys who haven't entered into the peace process, former paramilitaries from an organization called AUC, and all those guys are involved in drug trafficking. We had to take that expression, the cartel de los soles, away from the indictment when it finally came down because that expression, the cartel de los soles, doesn't really exist. It was something invented by journalists, kind of like even like poking fun of it. Soles are sons that the Venezuelan military designate rank on their epaulets. Uh, there is no organized. It's a group of informal officers from the security services dealing and making deals with mid-level and sometimes large-scale traffickers, but it's not an actual cartel. So that's a false statement. But it's really concerning, as Ambassador Shapiro mentioned, from the narcotics perspective, it really makes no sense. It certainly when you compare it to the Hernandez indictment. So we're really at a cross paths. If we're going to leave people in place that were on those indictments calling the shots in Venezuela, and don't underestimate Diosdado Cabello, who's vicious and he's rounding up people now as we speak, as Ambassador Shapiro mentioned. And remember, no one has mentioned the 800 to 900 political prisoners that are in custody now in Venezuela and subject to torture on a daily basis. So it certainly seems that a lot of this is more focused on oil than on democracy or law enforcement.
Thanks to both ambassadors. Both Aaron and I are going to ask both of you just a couple of questions to set the context, a little more context before we turn to audience Q&A. So Ambassador Shapiro, let me start with you because I know that you have had relatively recent conversations with the head of the opposition, Maria Machado. You know, as we all are looking at this story, right, there's this kind of cast of characters. So what I'm going to ask you to do, and Ambassador Moreno, feel free to weigh in, give us a brief understanding of who are these people. We have Maduro, we have his wife, we have Machado. So if you could do that, that would be wonderful. The sort of the protagonists of this story, that would help give us some background. I'm going to invite you to unmute, Ambassador Shapiro.
I'm trying. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I had a moment of panic there. I couldn't figure out how to unmute myself. And I apologize, Ricky. Tell me the question again. Give me the short version of the question.
Of course. This story, as we're watching it unfold live in the media, has this leading cast of characters. Tell us what you know about the president, his wife, the head of the opposition, and other protagonists of this story.
Okay, so here's the weird thing. I was ambassador to Venezuela almost 25 years ago. These are the same people who were there when I was ambassador. I mean, they haven't changed. They've changed jobs. Like me, they've turned gray and put on weight, but they are exactly the same people. Um, I knew Maduro, but not well because he refused to meet with me. I tried to set up meetings. Actually, I mean, he was in the National Assembly. He was a congressman at the time. And a guy in the National Assembly from his party said, look, Shapiro, you need to meet this guy. And he stood me up multiple times. The intermediary set up meetings. He wouldn't come to my house. I invited him to come have lunch with me. He wouldn't do that. And then he stood me up at hotel bars where he wouldn't meet with me. His wife, Celia Flores, was a member of the Congress, the National Assembly at the time. She was a very, very junior backbencher. Diosdado Cabello at the time was I can't tell you what ministry he was the minister of, but he was the minister of something. And I met with him in his office. And I mean, he was the tough guy. He's the enforcer within Chavismo. I mean, so essentially what you've done is you've taken Chavismo is the political movement that ran the country, rewrote they actually called a constitutional convention and wrote a constitution that was, made to measure. It's exactly what you would want if you want to run a country in an authoritarian manner. That's exactly what they did. Their political program was called 21st Century Socialism, which wasn't much different from 19th and 20th century socialism. I mean, it was essentially confiscate stuff, nationalize stuff, and give it to friends of yours. So it really has not worked out at all. So Venezuela, when I was there, produced 3.2 million barrels of oil a day. Right now, it's managed to get back to 1 million barrels a day. The economy I doubt that they're the poorest people in Latin America, but they certainly are close. And it used to be the wealthiest country on a per capita basis in Latin America and the Caribbean. That's why somewhere between 8 and 9 million Venezuelans, a third of the population of, think about that, a third of the population has fled the country. That would be uh, what 100 million Americans leaving the U.S. I mean, think about that. Um, Most because it was so damn poor and they couldn't get food, and but a lot of them also because of oppression by the Chavez and the Maduro government. They had a point where they reached inflation of 1 million% a year. 1 million%. I don't even know how you measure that. I mean, we were all outraged when under the Biden administration, inflation in the United States reached what, 9%, something like that.
Mhm.
This is 1 million%. I have to say that again. They had to take the money and drop zeros off their currency and reprint new currency.
Mhm.
Well, while I was there, and they did this, first they dropped three zeros. Then like a year later, they dropped two zeros, which is really stupid. If anybody gets to be the president of a central bank somewhere, only drop three zeros at a time. Doing two is just a disaster. Um, and they
Charles,
re
tell us about
and I can
Maria.
go on. I can go
Yeah,
on.
tell
You
us
know.
about Maria Machado. I know you have a relationship with her.
Yeah, so I met with her in my office. I mean, she was in her 30s at the time, if I'm not mistaken, probably late 30s, and she was like a geeky consultant type person who had worked for one of the international consulting firms in Venezuela, and I want to say McKinsey and Company, but that may not be right. And she and the colleague who was with her, they had requested the meeting. They were in my office, and they were these people who were super wonky. And we need to do this to follow the new constitution, do that, and we're going to get people organized so that under the new Bolivarian constitution, people know what their rights are and can exert their rights. And one of the things the Constitution had was a provision for a recall referendum, which some U.S. states have. And they wanted to get to a recall referendum. I never crossed my mind that 25 years, this woman who was in my office would receive the Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, and rightly so, for standing up for democracy in Venezuela, using those same skills, organizing people. And the way we know that the election was stolen is they trained and organized poll watchers, a huge number at every polling station in a country of 30 million people, right? Who they trained them when the vote is over under Venezuelan law, just like it is under Georgia law, and I assume Texas and Florida law. The poll watchers get a copy of the results from that voting station, an official copy. And then you can go online and see your precinct, how many people voted, how many for party A and how many for party B. And so what they train their people to do is take their copy of the official results, scan it on their phones immediately, use an app that they had developed to send it in to their own voting computation center. And when the National Elections Council realized that Maduro was losing the election, they suddenly had a computer outage, right? And went off air, and they stopped updating the website and come back 3 hours later and say, we've counted every vote. Here's the result, and never gave the precinct by precinct tallies, right? Even, I mean, the Carter Center in his very polite way is, this does not meet international standards for elections. Anyhow, that it is just amazing the theft and corruption on the political system and the economic system and throughout the country. Stop there.
which
Thank you.
makes it
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, please.
which makes it all the more tragic or sad that she, who risking her life and hiding, defying the authorities, was so dismissed in President Trump's comments immediately following the operation, where he said she just doesn't have the popularity, she doesn't have the respect. It's such a disappointing thing to hear instead of saying, there's a path to have her reached. The other thing I just quickly, Aaron, want to mention the effect on Colombia. Remember the initial thing when Charles mentioned about people not having enough to eat. The average Venezuelan during this period of time lost anywhere from 19 to 24 pounds, by World Health Organization standards. And that's amazing. And Colombia undertook the remarkable thing of being able to give 4 to 5 million Venezuelans Colombian residency and work permits, and it recognized their asylum status, which is really kind of amazing. That had immense social and political effects, and which continue to this day. And now what's going to happen will be even more unsettling to Colombia, which has presidential elections in 3 months. So that also is a side effect of all these things, which could be very important.
Ambassador Moreno, I wanted to thank you for that. I wanted to jump on the explanation you gave about the Cartel de los Soles. So, from your explanation, it isn't necessarily that the Venezuelan state itself is a organized formal cartel, but I think the big question remains amongst a lot of Americans is essentially whether Maduro and to a degree his family, whether they are directly involved or passively involved in the narcotics trade at the highest levels of the Venezuelan state. I'm thinking also about back to 2015 when there was the Narco Sobrinos affair, where Maduro's nephews were
Nephews.
arrested by the
Yeah.
DEA in
Yeah.
Haiti, I think with a private plane full of cocaine, right?
Right.
So the question is, I think a lot of people are trying to understand how high up does this go in Venezuela, and how do you see that from your experience in the counter-narcotic space?
There's no doubt, I think, that the Maduros were involved in drug trafficking, at least in receiving, cash and all sorts of things for protecting people, getting their nephews involved, all sorts of things. So there's no doubt. But to say that it was an organized narco state, yes and no, just like Honduras was. And as I said, the Cartel de los Soles is kind of informal. It's not like the Sinaloa cartel or the Nueva Generación cartel in Mexico. It's not like that. It's just shifting alliances, allegiances, and corruption. Corruption remains at the heart of the drug trade in Venezuela, as it does in other parts of the world, including fortunately Mexico to a great extent. But that doesn't mean the government is controlled by the cartels. I don't think that's the case in Mexico. I think they have tremendous influence, but not necessarily run it. But yes, the drug trafficking business in Venezuela was at the highest levels. And I'm sure the Minister of Interior, the Minister of Defense, and a lot of those folks are, Delcy Rodriguez, interestingly enough, was not on the indictment. And maybe ask Charles about it. I don't know if that was intentional or what that was. But yes, certainly very strong high involvement from people but not fentanyl. Fentanyl does not, go through Venezuela. It doesn't get sent to the United States, and remember that the drug trafficking business as a whole is like a big balloon. You squeeze one part of the balloon and then it comes out the other way. We used to have massive amounts of assets in the Caribbean, not military assets, but over the horizon radars, coast guards that would intercept these fast boats and these ships. And what you would do is not blow them up out of the water and kill people, but you would capture the boat, you capture the crew, you interrogate them, and you find out where they were going and who they were going to supply and trace it higher, 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 and all the way up to the distribution routes in the United States, Mexico, or wherever. But we're not doing that. So this whole law enforcement approach really seems very superficial and not perfectly, transparent to say the least.
We already have a lot of questions coming in. Thank you to those of you who are submitting. We have several hundred people, and we are not going to be able to get through several hundred questions, but thanks to all of you for joining. If you do have a question, please put it in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen so that we can hopefully get to it. or a question like it and answer your question. So before we go to audience questions, I will ask both of you, what does success look like? If you are in charge from the American perspective, how would you define success based on where we are now?
May I go first?
Go for it.
Okay. I mean, first of all, you can't go back. You can't undo
Nope.
what's already happened. I mean,
Based on where we are now.
yeah, and so,
Success.
it's easy to say, oh, they should have done X, Y, and Z, and they've already decided to do X. What strikes me is super important right now, and it's hard, it's difficult, is that there have to be in Venezuela people who are not politicians, but who are respected.
Hmm.
They may be religious, faith leaders, super lawyers, sort of Vernon Jordan, right? Academics, business people who are respected by both sides. And if it were me, I'd, find a way to get these people talking to each other, maybe outside of Venezuela, and to figure out a way to move Venezuela towards democracy, set out a timetable, a map of how you do this. And that's really, really hard. But as Ambassador Moreno can tell you, they managed to do this in Colombia with narcotics traffickers and paramilitary armies and the government of Colombia and figure out how to reintegrate former arms carrying killers from the right and the left into Colombian society. If Colombia can do it, Venezuela can do it. And I recognize, and I want to say right here, it's going to be an unbelievably difficult task to achieve that.
Yeah, I concur. Civil society is essential, and I like the idea you said about having it outside of Venezuela. Actually, the progress that's been made in another failed state, Haiti, some of the best initiatives that have almost gotten off the ground were based on civil society initiatives, which I know very well. But I think one of the things I would do if I were the king of the United States foreign policy is, stop this thing about alienating everyone else. We need Petro or at least the Colombians to help put something together. We need the Mexicans to try to help put something together. We need the all of Latin America. We need the OAS. We need the UN to be able to put a timetable in to establish some type of provisional government. But we have done just the opposite. We've alienated all our neighbors. We've even threatened them. And that's not the way you're going to do things. We've got to try to find a way to reasonably walk that back and work. And this America first shouldn't be America alone. And that's what we're seeing right now. And we're just really angering and threatening the very people that we need the most to make this thing work.
Thank you very much, both of you. Ambassador Shapiro, I have a last question, and then we'll pivot over to audience Q&A. I'm curious, and I think many people around the country and around the world, indeed, are asking themselves, what does it mean when the president says that we will run Venezuela? And specifically, to what degree should we take that literally? And how likely do you think that the Venezuelan government, now led by President Delcy Rodriguez, is likely to submit? From my understanding, and you may have personally met her during your tenure as ambassador, she's no less an ideologue than Chavez, than Maduro. I believe she was actually Chavez's chief of staff at one point, and kind of see it as even perhaps more hardline than him at times, if that's possible. So how do you see her likelihood to sort of submit, for lack of better words, to the will of the administration, if that's what will require us to have a kind of lighter touch running of Venezuela?
Well, the traditional way to run a country is to run a country, right? I mean, this is the time where you would love to have Voice of America broadcasting to not just to Venezuela, but to Latin America, and you'd love to have Voice of America broadcasting to Iran. You would love to have, there were people at USAID whose jobs were to do this, who knew how to, whether it's run a refugee camp or strengthen the integrity of the voter lists in country X. There are people who knew how to do that. I mean, and that ability has been lost, right? Because those people have all been fired. And so that's a, to my, I mean, now we need them, right? And so it was obviously a very short-sighted move. So we're going to try to run the country without running the country, without hands-on, without putting U.S. military, without putting U.S. civilian personnel, without hiring, Catholic Relief Services or whoever it may be to go in and provide those kind of services. And I think that's going to be really complicated. So, I mean, I think everybody saw online this morning where the Secretary of Energy says, well, we are going to sell Venezuelan oil and we will direct those funds. So far as I know, the U.S. has never done that before. The U.S. government doesn't buy and sell oil. U.S. companies do. And so the Secretary of Energy is going to sell Venezuelan oil to whom? And how? And I don't believe there's a legal framework in U.S. law to allow that to happen. I mean, I suppose it could work. It might be possible, but that strikes me as a super long shot. And just if I can go back for just a second, before the 2024 election, the belief among the people who are the supporters of the president is that the U.S. government was unbelievably incompetent. Now their belief is the U.S. government is unbelievably competent, right? I mean, think about that. Just the idea that suddenly, we've got people in the Department of Energy who can take care of this and know how to do this just strikes me as taking a great leap of faith.
Yeah, if I could follow up on that, because I think the point about firing everyone in USAID and the Voice of America now when they're needed more than anything, not only is it going to make it very difficult to get Venezuela on its feet and quote unquote run, but it's also an opening to our rivals. In Africa, you're seeing it. Russia and to a great extent China have filled that void of feeding programs, of development programs, of construction programs, good governance projects that we would do through USAID. And now our rivals and quite frankly, our enemies are taking advantage of that. And in Venezuela, this could take on a very potentially explosive situation that certainly the Chinese, for one, won't be shy about trying to exploit.
Well, we are going to turn to audience Q&A. So we have a thank you to our producer, Nathan, who is condensing a lot of questions, probably over nearly 100 questions so far. A lot have had to do with Cuba, so let's start there. And this is a question for both of you. To what extent does Cuba still have influence over the administration in Venezuela, and what comes next for Cuba?
It had gigantic influence over the administration up till Saturday. Cuban troops in Venezuela, the presidential guard was being consisted of a Cuban Special Forces unit. When I was there, and I guarantee you this has not changed, the Cuban ambassador would meet with the Venezuelan cabinet, right? And was essentially considered part of the cabinet. I'm sure Cuban influence has not decreased. So getting rid of them, is that a good thing? Yeah, I sure think so. But then what comes next? What's going to happen? There's a whole bunch of questions that need to be answered.
Next question here is, For both ambassadors, how do you expect that these events will reshape the security, economic, or diplomatic partnerships between other Latin American countries and the United States? So essentially, the blowback or the impact on U.S. LATAM relations after these events.
Lou, why don't you take that?
Well, I think what we're seeing is that we're trying to put it mildly, reinforce the Monroe Doctrine, which came into effect in 1823, which was based to keep European powers from encroaching on the Western Hemisphere. And as the president said, he's going to put his version of the Don Road Doctrine, which was an interesting turn of the phrase. Um, I think it sends a wrong message. I think it sends threatening Colombia, for instance. What we're doing is taking a tremendously unpopular president in Colombia who's made a mess out of everything, who's had his own scandals as well, but he's not a drug trafficker. He's not the head of a cartel. He's not doing enemy. Colombia, a country that has sacrificed more than any country in Latin America as far as deaths of prosecutors, of judges, of policemen, of military guys, of civilians and collateral damage of, you want to talk about narco terrorists? The real narco terrorists were in Colombia when they were blowing up jet airliners, when they were blowing up apartment buildings and killing people, in massive numbers. Those were narco terrorists. And Colombian government, against all odds, fought against that and actually prevented the FARC from taking the country at one point when it looked like that was. So you're alienating Colombia, threatening with military action. You're alienating the Mexicans. You're alienating anyone else. The Chileans are very ticked off right now. So what you're doing is you're either with me or you're against me, and it's just not the way you do diplomacy. It's not the way you do things. It may work in the short term to make everyone afraid of you, but in the end, then when you might need something, guess what? You're not going to get it. So I think we're really shooting ourselves in the foot and we're really taking a step backwards. And you look at the Greenland thing, we haven't touched on that. I mean, threatening a NATO ally who shed blood for the United States of America after NATO declared Article 5 after 9/11. They Denmark did, I believe. That'd be like the United States losing like 5,000. Uh, we're bullying them into giving us Greenland when we already have unlimited basing options there under previous agreements. So I think that we've taken a really major step backwards, not only in Latin America, but certainly in Europe and maybe perhaps even the rest of the world.
We'll go to the next question, which actually picks up on the Greenland issue. This question, should we anticipate this as a declaration from this administration as a transition from America's previous position of upholding the global order to a new role for America as a self-interested agent in a multipolar world? And we might add that the Western Hemisphere, from Venezuela up to Greenland, if that's how people choose to read it, is our polar.
I mean, the answer to your question is to the person who submitted the question is yeah. I mean, that's exactly what we're doing. Um, Listen, I was on a Zoom call with some people from Greenland on Monday. I used to serve in Denmark. Greenland is part of the Kingdom of Denmark. I've never been there, but we in 1916, Robert Lansing was the Secretary of State and signed a treaty with Denmark that recognized Danish sovereignty over all of Greenland. That's it was part of a deal. That's when Denmark sold the United States what had been the Danish Virgin Islands and became the U.S. Virgin Islands. At the end of the Second World War, we signed a treaty with Denmark that gave the United States the right to build an unlimited number of bases in Greenland. I think at one point we had 18, 19 bases in Greenland. It's we unilaterally who've pulled out and have one base in Greenland with 200 troops there now. But that treaty would allow us to, in fact, reopen those bases or build new bases. Um, But what it really does is it undermines our most important alliance, NATO. Greenland is part of NATO. And let me say that again. Greenland is part of NATO. So for the United States to bully a NATO ally and demand that we're going to seize the country has got implications way beyond the island of Greenland and its 60,000 inhabitants. I mean, it's just as short-sighted as you can be. It has, and you saw that with the European allies yesterday issued a statement. Can you imagine that? The European allies, our allies, issued a statement supporting the United States and chastising the United States for what we're saying in Greenland. That's just phenomenal. So, if you're the Prime Minister of Canada, if you are the President of Panama, um, you know, what does this mean? I mean, we're going back to great power politics in a world where there are three great powers. And I'm going to finish the lecture here, I apologize, is our parents and grandparents at the end of the Second World War set up an international system that favored the United States, but also favored Denmark and Canada and Venezuela, a system where there were rules for international trade, there were rules for international relations, there was rules for how did you clear money if it's flowing this way and that way, international police force, cooperation among police, which has been of huge benefit to the United States. It does restrict us. It means we can't do whatever we want. And that's what we are walking away from now, and we're doing that at our own peril.
Yeah, if I could follow up on that just very briefly, this might makes right policy that we seem to be embracing. What does that say to the Chinese in Taiwan? If we can go in and do whatever we want in Venezuela, then the Chinese can say, well, the Americans can do that, then we can take to Taiwan. What does it say to Vladimir Putin in his efforts to conquest Ukraine and possibly more? So we're really sending a really dangerous message to the entire world, which may come up and bite us in the rear end.
Thank you both. The next question here is, how does the administration perceive the reaction from the rest of the world? And are there perhaps any reactions, such as sanctions, which might give the administration pause before it takes other unilateral actions? Or is the lack of reaction by the world, is there a lack of reaction by the world that will embolden more policy in this direction? And on that point, one of the things that maybe just a quick point, we got a lot of questions asking if you can just concisely define the Monroe Doctrine. I know we've mentioned it, but for those less familiar, just a concise definition of how the Monroe Doctrine, how it might apply today, since it's come up a lot.
The lack of reaction from the administration is because there's a lack of reaction from the administration. I mean, I assume that means they don't care, right? Otherwise, they'd be saying stuff. The Monroe Doctrine, 1823, as Ambassador Moreno said, and essentially this was when the Latin American countries were mostly had just become independent in the past 10 to 15 years. Some of them were still fighting for independence in 1823. And what it said was the United States, which had virtually no Navy at the time and no way to enforce this, is that the United States would not accept the imposition of new colonies in the Americas by the Europeans. Then you have to jump 100 years to Theodore Roosevelt, who reinterprets the Monroe Doctrine to say the United States has the ability to intervene in Latin American countries when they are taking actions which put at risk, which would invite European intervention. In other words, there were a number of countries at the time, Latin American countries, that were had taken loans from Europe and hadn't paid back the loans. And so, the Europeans sent ships to blockade their ports to demand that they be paid. And what the Monroe Doctrine said is, we will not accept this. We'll send our ships in, take over the country, and make sure they repay those debts. Lou, what have I forgotten about the Monroe Doctrine?
Yeah, no, I think you hit it on the head. And as I said, interesting turn of the phrase that the president used when he now calls it the Donroe Doctrine. But it's antiquated. It's dealing in 19th century reality when when we're in the 21st century and there's an entire world global community which we seem to be kind of just overlooking at this point.
You can both be forgiven for not having memorized the Monroe Doctrine. It was, what, 200 years ago. So, our next question. We have about less than 10 minutes left. So, let's see how much progress we can make until just before 1 o'clock when we will bring this conversation to a close. Are we witnessing a post-global liberalism era in which realism has reasserted itself? And does U.S. engagement in Venezuela reflect national security priorities, particularly in countering China, to a lesser extent, Russia and Iran, rather than economic interests such as oil and narcotics?
That's a great question. I'm sure there are, graduate students who are busy writing theses about this and dealing with all these issues. The short answer is we're returning to global, the might makes right, that the rules are unimportant. To my way of thinking, I mean, what makes this more complicated is there are no Chinese troops in Latin America. I mean, outside of defense attaches and their embassies. The way that what China is doing in Latin America, they're doing because the United States has not done it. In other words, the Chinese are willing to make loans to countries to build needed infrastructure that the U.S. doesn't do that, right? But U.S. banks have been unwilling to finance the building of a gigantic port in Lima, right? The Chinese did it. In return, they get the receipts from the profits of that port for X number of years until they get their debt paid off. Chinese are financing a road that'll go over the Andes from that port in Peru to Brazil. And the Chinese are doing that all over Latin America and Africa. And we're not doing it. I mean, the United States private sector, for a whole bunch of very good reasons, put its attention on East Asia. And except for commodities, has by and large ignored Latin America. And that opened Latin America up to the Chinese. But there's no Chinese troops. I assume there's Chinese spies, but there's no Chinese troops in Latin America that are threatening U.S. interests. The Russians, so far as I know, have no troops in Latin America. We're saying we're friends with Russia and we're going to solve the Ukraine war, but Russia represents a threat in Greenland and in Venezuela. That doesn't hold up.
Yeah, but part of the way I see things, one of the worst things that we're doing now is we're disregarding the entire process of foreign policy. There used to be a really pretty, respected by both parties, administrations of both parties over the years. But now we seem to be conducting foreign policy by by social media, by tweets, by a thought that the executive branch had, and it's sent out, and then everyone responds to that and tries to get that done. I think that's a tremendous mistake to do policy, foreign policy, national security policy, really on the fly and on whims. I think that's a tremendous mistake. Strategic shifting, as I mentioned, the danger in that is that comes to get us with the Chinese in Taiwan and the Russians in Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. So people can argue the national security aspects of it, but the narcotics thing, I think that I've kind of knocked it down in my opinion about fentanyl doesn't come from Venezuela. The ships that have been blown up weren't going to the United States. They didn't have the range to make the United States. The cocaine wasn't even destined for the United States, and sometimes cocaine wasn't even on these boats. It was marijuana. So I think we really have to reassess things. And again, for me, getting other people involved, getting other countries involved, and doing this multilaterally, civil society and all the trade, we have to get back to some kind of the traditional things that used to work in the past, and just blazing a trail forward without any rhyme or reason is not the way forward, in my opinion.
We're running short on time, so I'm going to combine two similarly asked questions. One is, why was Maduro given due process, yet the people on those boats that the ambassador was just mentioning were not? And what considerations went into in capturing Maduro versus eliminating him? And then the second related
I'm sorry,
question is,
versus what?
why was Maduro given due process when the people on the boats were not? Essentially, why was Maduro captured instead of eliminated? And then the related question is, to what extent do we believe that there was assistance or approval by the Maduro regime to remove Maduro from his position in Venezuela?
The last part is I don't know that, and then stuff will come out later, presumably. Who are we talking to offline? But I don't know that there was any approval in advance. Well, why are we giving Maduro due process? Because that justifies the intervention in Venezuela, right? If we say it's a police action, so we've grabbed the president and taken him to New York to put him on trial, and in some ways that serves to justify the intervention in the first place. Why we didn't give due process to people on the boats, I think Ambassador Moreno has laid that out. I'm a former Coast Guardsman. That's called murder. That's called murder.
Yeah.
You don't kill criminals in the United States. You put them on trial. What the Coast Guard does, as Lou explained, you stop the boats, you inspect them, you find the drugs and seize them, and you arrest the perpetrators and bring them to the United States to go on trial. Bam. Blowing up a boat is extrajudicial killing, which is the nice way to say murder.
Ambassador
Absolutely.
Moreno, any final thoughts?
No, I think my former boss got it right as he usually does and was 100% spot on.
Well, that is the time that we have. I I'm so grateful to both of you. I think I speak for Aaron and myself, the university, the World Affairs Council of Miami, and the World Affairs Council of Atlanta, along with the partner World Affairs Councils who have joined us today. Thank you to the several hundred people. I think we surpassed 500 people who joined us today, which goes to show how timely and frankly how many questions people still have about this developing story. I'm going to give the X handles of our ambassadors so that if you would like to engage with them directly, DM them or follow their commentary. For Ambassador Moreno, it's at Luis Moreno LG, LuisMorenolG. And then for Ambassador Shapiro, he's at Shapiro _ WAC. That's SHAPIRO _ WAC. If you're not on X, you can go ahead and subscribe to our newsletter at wacatlanta.org. And then you can, we'll have more upcoming programs, certainly on Venezuela, as well as all of the rest of our programs. Aaron, would you like to jump on and give your website so people can subscribe to your newsletter before we wrap up?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ricky. Ours is very simple, worldaffairs.miami. If you search us just like that, you'll find us and you can subscribe to our mailing list and you can see our upcoming events. I know we have people calling in from all across the country, but for any South Floridians, we welcome you. Most of our events are free and open for the public as part of our nonprofit mission to enhance local access to high quality information on U.S. foreign policy and international affairs. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you, ambassadors. Thank you, Ricky, and thank you, Nathan, on the back end, and to our partner councils in San Antonio, Connecticut, and all across the country. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Thank
And
you
we'll
very
see you
much.
soon. Take care. Thank you, ambassadors.
It's been an honor. Thank you.